terror group ISIS in Iraq. This, as the Obama administration says, the U.S.'s humanitarian mission is to stop the threat of genocide. My next guest was born in Somalia and subjected to the harsh realities of radical Islam. She's now an American, where she's free to speak out against the treatment of women in some Islamic societies. You'll recall this spring when Brandeis University had invited her to receive an honorary degree, then rescinded under pressure from critics who called her an Islamophobe. Ayaan Hirsi is a fellow with the Future of Diplomacy Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, as well as at the Harvard Kennedy School, and founder of the AHA Foundation. And she joins me now. Ayaan, I want to thank you so much for being here. You have been a heroic and clear voice of reality when it comes to the world of Islam. And a lot of Americans see groups like ISIS, they see Hamas, and the view that people have of Islam is not a very positive one because of this. How does that differ from the Islam that you grew up with as a girl in Somalia?
The Islam I grew up with in Somalia, I would say, is the Islam of the masses. And if I take one individual to represent the masses of peace-loving Muslims, it would be my grandmother. I grew up with my grandmother. She wore amulets. She prayed. She was pious. But she minded her own business. In my grandmother's Islam, there was no jihad. There was no Sharia. There was a lot to comment on her beliefs. But what we are seeing now is very different from that. And it's women like my grandmother, like my mother, and the mothers of all these boys and men who are being sacrificed to jihad today, who are wringing their hands in despair, who are saying we reject the Islam of Hamas and ISIS and Wahhabi Islam and Al-Qaeda and all these other extremists. But unfortunately, that Islam of my grandmother is not organized. It has not produced a counter-narrative. It is saying at this point, they're just the victims. They're passive. They have nothing to say in return.
It would be helpful if more people you do. But unfortunately, we don't hear a lot of voices from the world of Islam that say the radicals are wrong and they're not representing us. Why not?
Well, we hear two types of voices. We hear one group who say, this is not me, it's not my Islam, and therefore it's not Islam. So we look at the atrocities committed by Boko Haram, by ISIS, who now call themselves IS, by Hamas, all of these groups, and we say it has nothing to do with us. But denial is not a counter-narrative. Denial is not policy. Denial is not strategy. It's not even tactics. It's nothing. It's just to say, no, this is not us. The other group, who have been our allies and friends for a long time, are countries like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar. Mm-hmm. And we have these nations who have produced radical Islam in the way that it's being taken to its logical consequence by groups like Hamas and ISIS and Boko Haram. But at the same time, they're having dinner with us and lunch with us, and we're diplomats and we're friends, and we're not, it's us really, it's us Americans who are not standing up to these groups and saying, we'll stop talking about these euphemisms like violent extremism. Let's talk about radical Islam.
If you could have given that speech at Brandeis that they asked you not to come and give, and if you could perhaps speak to foggy-bottom diplomats over at the State Department, what would you say that we ought to be doing differently as a nation in dealing with the issue of Islam and the radicals?
I would say that we are dealing with we are engaged in an ideological war that we do not want to fight. So today, please help out the Yazidis, the Christians. Please, let's do what is right to do. That is an emergency. On a second level, please, let's get together, and instead of addressing all these various brands of radical Islam, today it's Boko Haram, tomorrow it's ISIS, then it's this brand or that brand. I mean, you could have a combination of all these brands, but ultimately what it winds up, what it really boils down to, is there is a movement that conflates politics with religion, and then declares jihad or holy war on everybody who doesn't believe in the way they do. And their victims, first and foremost, are Muslims, men and women. And then the rest of us, if we don't believe in the way they do, from their perspective, we need to die. Theirs is a creed of death.
And I think that's what's so frightening, because this is not just a threat to Christians or to Jews, it's a threat to every person on the earth who does not accept their radical version of it. And that's what's so very frightening. Well, when we come back, you're going to hear Ms. Hirsi Ali's perspective on the Israeli-Hamas conflict and a surprising view about who might ought to get a Nobel Peace Prize. We'll ask her about that when we return. Activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan, you've been very vocal in your support for Israel in this horrible conflict that they've been involved in the last several weeks. That seems to be quite unusual. I don't hear many people who are Muslim who are speaking out on behalf of Israel. Why?
I support Israel primarily because it is not only a democratic and free government in that region where there is a lack of that, but Israel is based on a creed of life before death. And they are facing enemies that want to annihilate not only Israel, but eliminate all Jews. And the enemies of Israel believe in a creed of death. For them, life is transitional. And so the life of their own children, the life of their own mothers, the life of their own wives and fellow civilians, it doesn't matter that much, because they're looking forward to death so that after death something wonderful is going to happen. And people don't see this basic difference. And it's so... If you don't see that, then you don't understand the conflict. I vote for life, so I vote for Israel.
You know, it's so remarkable and refreshing to hear you say that. But it's got to also put you in a dangerous place. Do you ever fear for your life that there would be some recrimination against you because of being a Muslim woman speaking out so clearly?
I am speaking out because I appreciate life. They want to take my life, and they wanted that for the past 12 or more years. And I think that the answer to that kind of threat is not passivity, because it gives them what they want. They can silence us all by threatening us all. What we need to do is to speak up for life and to take all the necessary actions for life before death, not after death. We need to support Israel. Because otherwise we are all in the position of Israel from their perspective.
You know, there's such a pressure on Israel to negotiate with Hamas. And even former President Carter, I was stunned by this. He came out and said that we ought to treat them like a state. They're a terrorist organization. You know, is there any point in negotiating with Hamas at all? Is there any value in that?
Okay, let's do what President Carter wants us to do and treat them like a state. States, you know, have conflict. How do you resolve conflict with states? You negotiate peace. So you believe there's a common ground. There is no common ground with an enemy that not only believes in death, but that only believes in your elimination. Then you have a second option, which is we could have some kind of coexistence, what Israel has been calling quiet for a long time. If the enemy is weak enough, we could keep them contained and, you know, we lead our own lives. But that's not happening. And so the third option, which is the least attractive of all options that Israel is faced with, is that they have to pacify Israel. And who will benefit from a full pacification of Israel, of Hamas? It is people who live in Gaza, the women and children who are now being used as human shields. Women and men, children are driven into hospitals, into schools, into places, and from that, rockets are launched.
You suggested that there was a person deserving a Nobel Peace Prize, kind of a surprise. Who's that person?
I said Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu deserves the Nobel Peace Prize because he is doing what is right for the citizens of Israel. And as you all know, in a democracy, when you're running for election, you say you're going to do what is the best for those people who elect you. And we are seeing a leader who is under tremendous pressure from inside and from outside. And he is forced in a place where he has to take these options and none of them are attractive. And time after time, he does what he promised to do.
Ayaan, you are a refreshing and wonderfully clear voice and sense, and I thank you so much for being here. I hope that our audience will find out more about the foundation that she heads up and support that foundation. The AHAfoundation.org is where you can get more information. What a delight to have you here. Well, up next...